As we move into our message for this morning, today we wrap up our Focus series. And so starting back in early July, we looked at focus, ways that practices that we can do that help us focus on our faith and grow our faith. And so we've talked about several of those, and this is the last week, and we'll talk about worship specifically, how to focus on worship and how the practice of participating in worship can help us grow in our faith. And so I'm very excited about that, and we've been sharing some of the same thematic elements with the children through the summer and through the VBS curriculum, and so I'm grateful for this season. And then, of course, we wrap it up today. And it did not occur to me until I was thinking about worship and thinking about you trying to focus on worship in the midst of whatever might be going on in your mind and your heart and your house right now, that the notion of focus is pretty, well, maybe it feels laughable to you. And I know that many of you, particularly if you're working at home where you didn't used to do that, or if your work primarily consists of something on a computer screen, that the idea of staring at a screen for another hour or so for worship, it doesn't always sound like the most exciting thing. And I totally get that. And I know that with so much going on, it can be difficult to focus. And so I just want to acknowledge that. I know that's challenging, most particularly in this season. I get that. The other little caveat that I guess I want to give is I suppose more than ever as a pastor, I'm preaching to the choir because you all have tuned in. And so know that I desperately appreciate that. I've got many faces here on shares, pictures that you all sent in, but it's not the same. And so I appreciate you worshiping, and I know that sometimes that takes some real intentionality and some real willpower to do in this season. And so I want to encourage you on that. As we prepare to talk about this, if you have a Bible, I want to encourage you to turn to 1 Chronicles 16, and we're gonna look through that. And I think it is this beautiful picture of a very particular sort of scene of worship that's happening. And so it comes from a very particular time, and we'll talk about that. But if you have your Bible, I want to encourage you to turn to that. We're going to read kind of section by section and talk about the way that it informs our worship and the way that it can sort of teach us about worship, what worship is and what it looks like. And my hope this morning is to talk generally about what worship is, how we engage with it, why it's important, and then at the end, as I've tried to do these last few weeks, to talk about some practical realities of it. And I hope through this entire series that you've heard each and every week, and I want you to hear it again this week, that this is intended in a very gracious manner. I know that there is so much weighing on us, and I hope that these practices don't feel like bludgeoning tools or like, here's one more thing that I have to do or that I'm falling short on or that I'm not doing. That's not what I intend at all. What I hope is that you found encouragement in these. All of these are what John Wesley would call means of grace. They're ways that we experience grace. Worship is a way that we experience grace. And so I want to encourage you and invite you into that, but I don't want any of this series and to feel heavy on you. I want it to all be encouraging and all be received in grace. So that's my last caveat for this morning, and we'll jump in to well, let's start at the beginning. A little bit of history for what's going on that leads us to 1 Chronicles 16. King David is in the throne, and they have just sort of settled the city where he will live, and he's built a palace for himself. And then the next thing is they put up a tent, and they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant into the city. And this is a huge, huge deal because the Ark of the Covenant represents for the people of God the very presence of God. It's how they know, how they experience that God is with them. It's how they communicate with God. It's where they offer their gifts in a sacrificial system. So this is a huge deal, cause for great, great, great celebration. And what commences is this worship service, and that's what I want to look at. But let's begin, if we shall, in verse 1, reading a little bit about what's going on. So let's just start 16, verse 1. They brought in the Ark of God and they set it inside the tent that David had pitched for it, and they offered burnt offerings and offerings of well-being before God. When David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the offerings of well-being, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord, and he distributed to every person in Israel, man and woman alike, to each a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. And let's just stop right there. Already from the beginning, we're experiencing something, and the reason that I think I was drawn to this passage particularly is because of that connection between this celebration and this worship and the receiving of food. Some translations say there's also wine that goes with all of that, which would have been an extra blessing, I think. But there's this connection between the joy and the celebration and the receiving of this meal. And when we gather in person at Common Grace, we partake in communion every week. Now, through this season of COVID and online worship, we've been doing it once a month. But there is this connection that I just couldn't help but notice between these two notions. And worship always for us helps provide a reminder of the goodness, of the abundance, of the provision of God. That's one of the things that we encounter when we gather and worship. I hope you encounter that when you gather and worship. And when we share, particularly in this meal, it is a tangible reminder of the God who is present and the God who provides for us. And we say when we take this that it's a reminder of that gift. And that's part of what worship is. It's a reminder that God's presence is always with us. It's a reminder that God provides for us, and it's a way that we receive strength in those promises to continue to face the days and the weeks ahead. And so we sort of begin with this kind of opening piece that sets the stage for this long song that will take place through most of the rest of the chapter. And so what happens immediately is you have these worship assignments. You go play the trumpet, you play the lyre, you make noise over here, somebody's got clanging the cymbals, you've got all that, and then you've got these singers, and then we read this song. So all of these worship leaders are put into place, and the words that follow, I think, help explain the heart and the purpose of worship and how we experience God in that. So if you're following along, back in chapter 16, verse 8, I want to read those first few verses of that song. Oh, give thanks to the Lord, call on his name, make known his deeds among the peoples. Sing to him, sing praises to him, tell of all God's wonderful works. Glory in his holy name. Let the hearts of those who seek the Lord rejoice. Seek the Lord and his strength. Seek his presence continually. Remember the wonderful works that God has done, God's miracles, the judgments God uttered. O offspring of his servant Israel, children of Jacob, his chosen ones. So I reached out to our worship leaders, to Eric and Chad, and I asked them a little bit about worship and what it meant to them and why it was important. And one of the things that Eric said that really stuck with me is he says, it gives words, it gives language to my gratitude for what I've been given, for what I'm able to do. Worship is a time where it sort of gives voice to that gratefulness that we have. And I love in that verse 12, remember the wonderful works that God has done, the miracles and the judgments. Part of our worship, part of the purpose of it is that it gives words to celebration. It helps us gather and not only name our personal celebrations and joys and triumphs and what we're grateful for, but it helps do that for us as a community, that we get to lift celebrations that we're having as a community, places where people are excited, good things that are going on. Now, that second part is important because sometimes, and maybe it's been heightened in this season, sometimes we struggle to find things to be grateful for. And I think sometimes we come into worship, and what can be helpful is not that we ask people to stuff the hard feelings or the difficult feelings, but it's a reminder that there are celebrations that continue to happen. So we get to lift some of those things up in song and prayer and word. We get to lift some of those up in community and what's going on in other people's lives, and we get to be thankful for those things. We get to give voice to that, and I hope that you experience some of that every time that you worship, that part of worship is an expression of gratitude or joy for what God has done, what God is doing in the midst of the world. And friends, I think we need to be reminded of those things, most especially in this season. Continuing on, verse 14, He is the Lord our God. His judgments are in all the earth. Remember his covenant forever, the word that he commanded for 1,000 generations. This, again, in difficult times, I think is a critical reminder because one of the things that worship helps us do is it helps us remember the long story, the long game of what God is doing. When we can so often get caught up in the moment, in the things that are right in front of us, whether they be great triumphs or very difficult seasons, we can get caught up in them. And what part of worship does is it reminds us of what God has been doing through all of history, what the church has done through all of history. It reminds us in the opportunity to gather with others that God is doing a lot of different things in a lot of different places. And so that's one of the reasons that I often like traditional elements in worship, whether that be using the full communion liturgy or prayers or the songs that we sing. It's a little bit of that, there's nothing new under the sun. Certainly the iterations of the problems that we face may be new, and the particular circumstances of our life may be new, but the notion that people are struggling with health and well-being and financial difficulties and things that they can't define or name or have power over, all of those things are written throughout our history. And when we read in the scriptures and when we hear in the songs that we sing, telling of those stories, those realities, it helps us remember that God has been working through God's people for a very, very, very long time. It helps us to name that, to claim that, to remember that, and to trust that God is going to continue to work in the midst of all that is going on. In this season of fighting for racial justice, it's helpful to remember that as long as God has been speaking, God has been in the business of working towards that. Even though it feels like sometimes the progress is slow or it feels like the progress is slowing down, that's been something that God's people have been a part of in a variety of ways for a long time. I mean, I think back to the words of Amos, the justice roll down like waters. That is something that we use in our time, but it's a reminder for generations and generations and generations. This has been a cry of God's people. We remember in the Exodus narrative, and particularly our African American brothers and sisters of the church remember and celebrate the Exodus narrative as seeing themselves, their story in that story. And so part of what I think this verse 15, remember God's covenant forever, the word that God commanded for 1,000 generations, is this reminder that God continues to work day after day. And on that thought of justice, I think that's part of what the writer, the chronicler, is trying to remind us in verse 19. When God's people were few in number, of little account, and strangers in a land, wandering from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another kingdom, he allowed no one to oppress them. He rebuked the kings on their account, saying, "Do not touch my anointed ones. Do not harm my prophets." It all is a reminder, and worship ought to be, when we come together, it ought to be a reminder that God is continuing to work in the world. God is continuing to move us towards justice and reconciliation. God is continuing to move us towards wholeness. God is continuing to work even in the most difficult and dark seasons of our life. And when we gather and worship, we get to be reminded of that in word, in song, in reflection, in the community that we gather in. And that's part part of why it's important for us to gather and worship, even if it's in this online place. That's part of why we ought to invest and focus in the work that's happening in worship. And so I want to jump ahead a little bit to a last little section, verse 28. Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. And then verse 29. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name, bring an offering and come before him. And this sort of brings me to the last point that I want to pull out of 1 Chronicles 16, that when we gather to worship, part of what we're doing is we're humbling ourselves. Part of what we're doing is we're realigning ourselves. We come and we sort of give God glory, we give God thanks, and in the act of worship, we're reminded who we are and who God is. And so again, in the conversations with Chad and Eric, one of the things that Chad said is he said, worship for me is like a reset. It's an opportunity where we get to come and we get to confess the places that we've fallen short in the week that we've come from. We get to bring those before God. We get to confess the places that we struggle. We get to come and just say, like, I'm out of strength. I don't know what to do. And God meets us in those moments, and we get to reset, we get to realign, and we get to move forward. And I think that's what the author is calling for. Ascribe to the Lord glory and strength, the glory due to God's name. Bring it all before God. And so we come and worship and we offer ourselves, as the communion liturgy says, as a holy and a living sacrifice in union with Christ's offering for us, that we may go into the world and others may encounter God through us. That's part of what we're doing. So one of the challenges that I want to give you this week is I want to challenge you, and I'm going to say every day. I think this is a great way to start your morning. 1 Chronicles chapter 16, verses 7 through 36. To read this psalm, to read this song that they sang in worship, and to go through all of it, because I think it does a lot, not only to teach us about worship life, but what it means to live day to day as the people of God. And so I want to challenge you in that. And friends, I know that it's difficult to focus in this season. I know that it's difficult sometimes to tune in. So whether you're joining us at 10:45 or you find another time through the week, I want to share just a few things real briefly that some of our folks around here shared that help us kind of focus on worship. So Grace Woods, our pastoral intern, talked about how lighting a candle as worship begins, even though she's in her own living room, is a way to help her focus on worship, to set a sort of sacred space and to identify this time as something different. Maybe that's something that you want to do. Eric suggested maybe dressing up a little bit. And I don't know what that means for you. Maybe it's putting on day pajamas instead of night pajamas, whatever the case is. But that's a way of sort of demarking something different and marking this time as something special and unique, and that's important. Chad talked about finding a peace mentally, emotionally, physically, if there are any peaceful physical spaces in your world right now, and using what you can to limit distractions. And I think all of those are marvelous suggestions about what we can do in this season. Nobody said go get donuts, which I think should have been on the list, but that may help you, or make some mediocre coffee that'll really bring you into the moment, whatever the case is. But the last thing that I'll end with is there are, even in this difficult season, there are some things that I think we can find as blessings from our worshiping in a new way. Number one, I hope that whether it's participating in the worship at home resources that our children's ministry staff provides Saturday, or your children participating in this worship service, I hope that this creates space for you to have conversation with your children, with your family, with your significant other, or perhaps if you don't have any of that, to reach out to somebody else that you would worship with, that you might see on a Sunday morning, and to be in conversation with them. I hope that we can continue to grow with one another in different ways, even in this season. Friends, the other piece is that you can do this in any time, in any space that you need. So if Sunday morning at 10:45 doesn't work, I mean, I love you gathering in that time, but this is available, and we put that out there. So, friends, in this week ahead, I hope you'll take that challenge to read through First Chronicles. And in the season that we're in, I hope that you'll continue to do what you can to focus on worship, to spend time and focus on nature, to spend time focusing on serving other people, to spend time taking Sabbath, focusing on Sabbath, setting intentional time apart. And that in the midst of all of that, I trust that you'll find God's blessing, you'll find God's renewing grace, and that you'll continue to grow in your faith. So may it be for each one of us today, in this season, and on all the days of our lives. Let's spend a few moments in reflection.